What can be more powerful than a nuclear bomb, yet never explode, and still erase an entire city from the map within hours? On November 8, 2013, Super Typhoon Haiyan made landfall in the Philippines, with sustained winds of 250 kilometers per hour, the strongest tropical cyclone ever recorded at landfall in human history. 6 million people were displaced, more than 6,300 lives were lost, and economic damage reached $2 billion, all within a single day. But to understand why Haiyan became the monster it was, we need to go back to the Pacific Ocean, where this story truly began. The Philippines sits in the path of an average of 20 tropical storms every year, but nothing could have prepared anyone for what was coming. The real question was never whether a powerful typhoon would strike the Philippines, but when and how strong. Leyte Island, where Tacloban city sits, is cradled inside Leyte Gulf, a naturally funnel-shaped bay opening directly to the east, like a trap set by nature itself. Most residents lived in low-lying wooden homes, less than 2 meters above sea level, built from lightweight traditional materials as local custom dictated. On November 6th, the Philippine Atmospheric Agency PAGASA issued signal number 3 warnings for affected provinces, the highest alert level available at that time. Hundreds of thousands evacuated, but many stayed behind, having survived typhoons before and believing this one would be no different. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, Haiyan was being fed by an unusually warm ocean, with sea surface temperatures reaching 30 degrees Celsius across a vast area. Warm ocean water is the fuel of tropical cyclones, and Haiyan had a nearly limitless fuel tank stretching thousands of kilometers before reaching the Philippines. Within 36 hours before landfall, Haiyan intensified from an ordinary tropical storm into a Category 5 super typhoon, a rate of intensification that left meteorologists stunned. The central pressure dropped to 895 millibars, one of the lowest pressure readings ever recorded in a tropical cyclone on Earth. For perspective, normal sea level pressure is 1,013 millibars, meaning Haiyan's center was nearly 120 units below normal atmospheric pressure. That night, along the eastern shores of Samar Island, residents could not sleep, as the wind sound built like an approaching freight train. At 4:40 in the morning on November 8th, Haiyan made its initial approach to the coastline of Guion, in eastern Samar, the first landfall point of this historic storm. Wind speeds of 250 kilometers per hour are equivalent to standing directly behind a jet aircraft during takeoff. Except this storm stretched across hundreds of kilometers. But wind was not what killed the most people in Haiyan. It was what scientists call a storm surge. A storm surge occurs when the enormous low pressure at a storm center literally sucks the ocean surface upward like a giant vacuum, while wind simultaneously pushes that water mass towards shore. The funnel shape of Leyte Gulf amplified this effect many times over, as the entire water mass of the bay was compressed into a single point, Tacloban. Around 7 in the morning, a wall of water, 4 to 6 meters high, slammed into Tacloban, not as individual waves, but as a single, solid mass of water, moving without pause. To visualize, a 6-meter wall of water is equivalent to a 2-story building, moving at highway speed. Water filled homes in seconds, and because it was loaded with timber, metal, and debris carried along with it, it became a grinding machine. This is why a storm surge is more lethal than ordinary flooding, because it doesn't just submerge, it pulverizes everything in its path. Within less than 1 hour, the entire coastal zone of Tacloban, spanning tens of square kilometers, had become an inland sea, floating with debris. Simultaneously, winds of 250 kilometers per hour were destroying everything above ground, turning metal fragments and timber into invisible projectiles. In Guyana, the first town to be struck, all 25,000 homes were destroyed or severely damaged within a matter of hours. The typhoon did not stop at a single landfall. It continued crossing the Philippine archipelago, making 6 separate landfalls in a single day. Ormoc, Baybay, Palo, Tanawan, and dozens of other coastal towns each received the same devastating blow within hours of each other. While still devastating later, the storm remained powerful enough to continue into Cebu, Iloilo, and finally Mindanao before finally weakening. But let us return to Tacloban, because this is where the greatest tragedy occurred, and where we must understand why the destruction was so catastrophic. Tacloban had a population of approximately 220,000 people, and a large portion lived directly in the low-lying zone struck by the surge. The storm surge in Tacloban penetrated 1.5 kilometers inland from the shoreline, completely obliterating everything within that zone. Sturdier structures such as schools, churches, and concrete buildings became last resort shelters for those who could not evacuate in time. The Santo Niño Parish Church of Tacloban, a red brick structure built in the 18th century, stood firm and became a gathering point for thousands in the aftermath. Tacloban Airport, sitting low and adjacent to the sea, was completely inundated by storm surge, and the passenger terminal roof collapsed under wind and water pressure. This meant that even after the storm passed, the first door to relief, the air corridor, was completely blocked for days. Meanwhile, in rural areas, the situation was even more extreme, as traditional rice-growing and coconut farming communities along the coast were completely swept away. Eastern Samar and Leyte provinces had economies heavily dependent on farming and fishing, and in a single day, both industries were nearly wiped out. 14 million coconut trees were destroyed, wiping out the livelihood of hundreds of thousands of farmers in the Philippines' largest coconut oil production region. A coconut tree takes 7 to 10 years to bear fruit, meaning farmers who lost their trees would have no income from those orchards for an entire decade. Back in Tacloban, as the waters slowly receded through the afternoon and evening of November 8th, the true scale of the disaster began to emerge. Coastal neighborhoods where thousands of families had lived were simply gone, leaving only a thick layer of mud and unrecognizable debris. That night, thousands of survivors sat amid the rubble, with no drinking water, no food, no electricity, and no communication with the outside world. Telecommunications infrastructure was completely destroyed. No phone signal, no internet, no local radio. Tacloban was cut off from the world. But this was not only Tacloban's story, because at the same moment, hundreds of other communities across the Visayas were experiencing the same. Ormoc City on western Leyte, though farther from the eastern shore, also suffered heavy damage as Haiyan's winds and rains attacked for hours. Cebu Island, home to Cebu City, the Philippines' second-largest metropolitan area, also suffered significant damage as Haiyan passed over, though the storm had partly weakened. In total, 15 Philippine provinces were declared national disaster zones in the wake of Haiyan's passage. But most of the world would not know the true scale of the disaster for days, because Tacloban and the hardest-hit areas were completely cut off. When the first images from Tacloban reached the outside world on November 9th, the international response was immediately overwhelmed by the scale of what they witnessed. The United States deployed the aircraft carrier USS George Washington to assist, while more than 60 nations pledged humanitarian aid. It became one of the largest humanitarian relief operations in Southeast Asian history, mobilizing thousands of relief workers from around the world. But in those first days, there were not enough trucks, not enough roads, not enough fuel to get relief supplies to everyone who needed them. This is a classic domino effect of large-scale natural disaster, when destroyed infrastructure paralyzes the entire response capacity. 3 days after the typhoon, more than 1 million people had still not received food or water from any relief organization. This is the brutal reality of disaster relief. Even the world's greatest efforts cannot reach everyone at once. Now let us talk about the real numbers, because these are figures that cannot be truly understood by simply reading them. 6,300 lives lost means each of those people had a name, a family, and a story. Cut short on November 8th, 2013. 6 million people displaced means an entire city, your whole world, all the memories stored in walls and drawers, suddenly ceasing to exist. $2 billion in economic damage represents schools, hospitals, bridges, roads, and millions of livelihoods that cannot be rebuilt by money alone. But the disaster did not end when the storm passed, because what unfolded in the first week tested the endurance of an entire nation. The Philippines had faced typhoons many times before, but Haiyan forced the country to question its entire early warning and disaster preparedness system. The core problem was not that the government didn't know the storm was coming. It was that people did not truly understand what a storm surge was, or how deadly it could be. The Philippine disaster warning system at that time had no separate storm surge warning level, and the words storm surge were not part of ordinary people's vocabulary. Now, let us look at the long-term impact. Because with a disaster of this scale, the scars are not only in the landscape, but run deep into society, economy, and environment. 1 million cubic meters of debris had to be cleared from Tacloban alone, a volume that, if loaded onto trucks, would form a convoy stretching from Manila to Singapore. The marine environment of Leyte Gulf and the coastal Visayas was severely impacted as storm surge washed enormous quantities of debris, waste, and hazardous materials into the sea. The coral reefs and mangrove ecosystems that served as natural coastal shields were also devastated, requiring years to recover. Economically, Leyte province lost approximately 25% of its provincial GDP in 2013 due to a single storm. Many families lost all assets accumulated across generations, from land and tools to something as small as personal documents that could not be immediately replaced. But from within this disaster, the Philippines and the international community learned lessons that could save millions of lives in the future. The first lesson: early warning systems must communicate not just storm intensity levels, but clearly and specifically what will happen to people in each specific zone. After Haiyan, the Philippines upgraded its typhoon warning scale to include signal number 5, with integrated storm surge warnings, a critical policy change studied by many other nations. The new warning system uses clear, color-coded inundation maps instead of technical figures, so that ordinary people without specialized knowledge can understand which danger zone they are in. The second lesson: the critical importance of mandatory evacuation. Because experience showed that when people had a choice, many would not evacuate, even knowing danger was approaching. After Haiyan, the Philippines enforced mandatory evacuation laws for high-risk zones, and when Typhoon Hagapit struck 1 year later, more than 1 million people were safely evacuated. The third lesson: the role of green infrastructure. As post-Haiyan data showed that coastal areas retaining mangrove forests suffered significantly less damage than deforested zones. This led to the largest mangrove restoration program in Philippine history following Haiyan, with a goal of restoring thousands of hectares of coastal forest. At the international level, Haiyan became the most vivid real-world evidence to that point of the link between warmer ocean temperatures and increasing tropical cyclone intensity. The Philippine delegation at COP19 in Warsaw made a moving statement about Haiyan while the storm was still devastating their homeland, calling for urgent global action on climate change. Climate scientists subsequently confirmed that while tropical cyclones are natural phenomena, climate change is making the most intense storms progressively stronger. This means storms like Haiyan, once considered once-in-a-generation natural extremes, may become a new normal of the 21st century. For rebuilding, the Philippines received more than $1 billion in international aid for Haiyan reconstruction, one of the largest humanitarian aid packages in Southeast Asian history. However, rebuilding is a process far more complex than simply constructing new homes. It also requires rebuilding communities, livelihoods, and crucially, relocating those homes to safer ground. The Philippine government designated no-build zones along the coastlines of areas that had been most severely struck by storm surge, prohibiting permanent construction within those boundaries. Despite this, enforcement of no-build zones faced significant social challenges, as many poor families had no alternative but to return to the dangerous coastal zone because it was the only place they could earn a living. This is perhaps the most important lesson Haiyan taught the world, that disaster risk management cannot be separated from poverty reduction and social inequality. When a storm strikes, those with money can drive to hotels in another city, while the poor have no vehicle, no money for a room, and often no one to call for help. This is why the most effective evacuation plans developed after Haiyan are those that proactively deliver transport to poor coastal communities, rather than simply issuing notifications and expecting people to find their own way. Haiyan also changed how the Philippines organized disaster response at the local level, with training of tens of thousands of community disaster response volunteers. 10 years after Haiyan, Tacloban has been substantially rebuilt, but the wounds remain. And each year, when typhoon season arrives, the memory of November 8th returns. This brings us to the final and most important lesson, that no disaster is entirely natural, because most damage comes from human choices made long before the storm arrives. When people choose to build homes at the water's edge for convenient fishing, when authorities lack resources to enforce no-build zones, when mangroves are cleared for shrimp farming, all those choices accumulate into catastrophe. But those choices are often not irresponsibility, but the compulsion of poverty, because people without money have no option but the cheapest land, which is usually the most dangerous land. This is why the United Nations, after Haiyan, integrated disaster risk reduction directly into the Sustainable Development Goals 2030, rather than keeping them as two separate domains. The Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction 2015 to 2030, adopted in part because of pressure from nations like the Philippines after Haiyan, sets targets to substantially reduce global disaster losses by 2030. Disaster warning technology also advanced dramatically after Haiyan, with significantly more accurate storm surge forecasting systems deployed across Southeast Asia. Mobile emergency SMS systems, community loudspeaker networks, and disaster alert applications were widely deployed to ensure warnings reached everyone, including those without internet access. When Typhoon Goni struck the Philippines in 2020 with intensity comparable to Haiyan, the new systems worked, and millions of people were evacuated before the storm arrived. The death toll from Goni was under 25 people compared to more than 6,300 in Haiyan, despite comparable wind strength. This is the clearest evidence of what early warning and timely evacuation can achieve. That means we did learn, truly learned, and applied what Haiyan taught at such terrible cost. But the real question is not whether we have learned Haiyan's lessons, but whether we have the courage to act on those lessons at the scale required before the next storm arrives. Super Typhoon Haiyan is not just the story of one storm, it is the story of the relationship between humanity and nature in the 21st century, a relationship changing rapidly and not always in our favor. the Pacific Ocean is warming, meaning the fuel for storms like Haiyan is not diminishing, but increasing with every passing year. More than 100 million people live in low-lying coastal zones around the world, all of them vulnerable to storm surges like Tacloban in 2013. But Haiyan also showed us that when we act, when we learn, when we invest in warning and evacuation systems, we can save lives even when the forces of nature cannot be stopped. The difference between Haiyan in 2013 and Goni in 2020, between more than 6,000 deaths and fewer than 25, is living proof that we can change the outcome. And that is why storms like Haiyan matter to all of us. Not just to Filipinos, not just to coastal populations, but to anyone living on this planet. Disasters like Haiyan are reminders that no matter how advanced our technology becomes, we share this planet with natural forces we cannot control, but can learn to live alongside. Every storm takes away things that cannot be replaced, but also leaves lessons that cannot be priced. And our responsibility is to ensure those lessons are never forgotten. Today, somewhere in the Pacific Ocean, a patch of warm water is quietly feeding a spinning cloud system, and no one yet knows what it will become. The question is not whether the next storm will come, but when it does, will we be ready? Super Typhoon Haiyan passed long ago, but what it taught us about the power of nature, the vulnerability of people, and the capacity of societies to change lives on, if we choose to listen.